On December 7, 1900, Supervisor Robert Muirhead stepped onto the eastern landing of Island Moor to carry out a routine inspection of the Flannan Lighthouse. He spent several hours working alongside the three keepers stationed at the post: James Ducat, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the assistant, and Donald MacArthur, a temporary replacement filling in for this particular shift. At the end of the day, as Muirhead prepared to leave the island, he shook hands with each man before stepping into the small boat that would take him back to the supply ship waiting offshore. The three men stood on the shore, raising their hands in farewell as the boat drifted farther into the sea. It was a familiar scene, just another part of the job. But what Muirhead did not know was that he had just become the last person to ever see them alive. 19 days later, when the relief vessel Hesperus arrived at the island with the next keeper and routine supplies, the lighthouse stood silent. Not a single soul remained. All three men had vanished from the island without leaving behind a single trace. In today's video, we're going to explore the enduring mystery of the disappearance of the three Flannan lighthouse keepers. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. The Flannan Isles are a cluster of 7 small islands located roughly 20 miles off the western coast of Scotland. On the map, they appear as nothing more than nameless specks of rock, marked only with nautical symbols and warnings of rough seas. But to the people of the Outer Hebrides, these islands have always carried an unsettling reputation. For centuries, no one had ever lived on the islands permanently. Occasionally, shepherds would bring sheep to graze on the thick vegetation that covered the land, but no one stayed overnight. The oldest villagers recalled that anyone who had ever slept there never returned for a second time. No one ever explained exactly why. They simply called Flannan a place not meant for the living. That was also the reason why construction of a lighthouse on Island Moor, the largest of the islands, had been delayed for years, even as the shipping route through the area grew increasingly dangerous. Many ships had already run aground in the fog or under the cover of night, and shipwrecks had become far too common. It wasn't until 1895 that construction of the lighthouse finally began. It would take 4 years of relentless labor under brutal weather conditions before the Flannan Lighthouse was completed and officially went into operation on December 7, 1899. The lighthouse was operated by 3 stationed keepers and 1 relief keeper who rotated shifts. They took turns living and working in what was considered one of the most remote outposts in the entire British lighthouse system. And it was there that a mysterious disappearance would soon unfold. On the night of December 15, 1900, the steamship SS Arctur was sailing through the waters off western Scotland on its journey from Philadelphia to Leith. As the vessel approached the area near the Flannan Isles, the ship's captain noticed something unusual. The lighthouse on Island Moor was not emitting any light. For an offshore stone light station that was supposed to be in active operation, the absence of illumination was a serious concern. Installations like Island Moor were specifically engineered to maintain a continuous beam, regardless of weather or season. A darkened tower could only mean one of 2 things: a severe technical failure or something far worse. As soon as the Arctur docked at the port of Leith, the report was passed to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The supply vessel Hesperus was immediately assigned to carry out an urgent inspection. But the weather had already begun to deteriorate. Cold early winter winds swept through the region, bringing hailstorms and heavy seas that rendered travel to the island impossible. Hesperus was originally scheduled to depart on December 20th, but worsening conditions forced it to remain in port for 6 more days. Throughout that time, no signals were sent from Island Moor. No one knew whether the 3 men assigned to the lighthouse were still alive or had met with misfortune. There was also no way to send a message to them. It wasn't until the morning of December 26th, after a brief window of calm, that Hesperus was finally able to set sail for the island. On board were the first people to set foot on Island Moor after 11 days of complete silence, and they, not long after arrival, would become the first witnesses to one of the most unsettling maritime mysteries in modern history. When Hesperus finally reached the eastern landing of Island Moor on the morning of December 26th, those aboard the ship immediately sensed that something was wrong. No one came to greet them. No flag had been raised on the mast as was customary, nor was there a wooden supply box left outside, ready for the routine exchange of goods. The entire island was swallowed in silence. The incoming relief keeper, Joseph Moore, was ordered to go ashore alone. He stepped onto the slick, wet stones of the landing and began the narrow ascent along the rocky path that led toward the lighthouse. As he walked, he called out the names of the 3 men he had been assigned to relieve, but received no response. The The gate leading to the lighthouse compound was closed but not locked. The main door was the same. Moore gently pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, into a space that, just a few weeks earlier, had been the living quarters of 3 men. The main room was so quiet he could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. The beds were still made, as if someone had just gotten up that morning and hadn't yet tidied them. The fireplace was filled with cold ashes, a sign that no one had lit a fire there in days. The dishes had been cleaned and neatly put away on the shelves. Everything was arranged with care. There were no signs of panic, no hints of haste. And yet, there were certain details that Moore would never forget. A wooden chair in the kitchen had been overturned, as if someone had stood up too suddenly. And every clock in the station had stopped ticking. Near the entryway, Moore noticed something else, something strange. On the coat rack, there was only one raincoat left hanging. The other 2 were gone. This suggested that at least 2 of the men had gone outside, perhaps to check the equipment or address a storm-related issue. But what about the 3rd? There was no reasonable explanation for why any lighthouse keeper would willingly step out into the North Atlantic winter without protective gear. To Moore, none of these details could be dismissed as coincidence. Everything inside the lighthouse pointed to something sudden, something that had happened without warning. After inspecting the interior of the lighthouse and finding no indication that the 3 keepers had left the island voluntarily, Joseph Moore and a team of sailors began surveying the rest of the area, focusing particularly on the western landing, a place regularly battered by powerful ocean swells. There, they found clear evidence that something violent had taken place. A large supply box positioned on a stone platform roughly 33 meters above sea level had been completely destroyed. Its contents, ropes, oil drums, tool containers, had been scattered as if the site had been struck by a sudden and forceful impact. Not far from there, the iron railings that lined the narrow path along the cliffside had been bent and twisted in unnatural shapes. The metal tracks used to haul supplies from boats up to the island had been torn out of place. Most striking of all, however, was a stone, weighing more than a ton, that had rested unmoved for years. It had been shifted from its original position. This wasn't something that could have been moved by human hands. It could only have been displaced by a force of enormous magnitude, like a rogue wave slamming into the cliffs at an unexpected moment. At the top of the cliffs, over 60 meters above the sea, the ground had been torn open in jagged streaks. A large section of the rock's edge had collapsed, exposing fresh cracks and hinting that an unusually powerful surge had swept through the area. Back at the lighthouse, Moore examined the logbook and discovered that entries had been recorded consistently up until 9 a.m. on December 15th, most likely the last words ever written by one of the 3 keepers. The notes contained no signs of conflict, no tension, no indication of any emotional unrest. There was nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary had been taking place. After the search yielded no results, the Northern Lighthouse Board launched an official investigation. Based on what remained at the scene, they arrived at what was considered the most reasonable conclusion, that the 3 men had met with an accident while trying to carry out their duties during a violent winter storm. According to the report, James Ducat and Thomas Marshall may have left the lighthouse to inspect equipment at the western landing site, the area noted as having sustained the most damage during the storm. Donald MacArthur, whose job it was to remain at the station, might have seen a massive wave approaching and rushed outside to warn his colleagues. But the wave came too quickly. All 3 were caught off guard and swept away before they could react. This scenario aligned with the physical clues found at the site: damaged equipment, torn earth and rock, and the 2 missing raincoats from the coat rack. It also offered a partial explanation for the complete absence of human presence on the island. However, there were small details that made this explanation difficult to accept in full. First, the gate and main door of the lighthouse had both been carefully shut when the first man set foot on the island. In an emergency serious enough to make someone forget to grab their protective gear, would anyone truly have had the time or composure to go back and close the doors? Second, lighthouse protocol required that at least one man always remain inside the station. For all 3 to leave, especially during extreme weather, would have been a clear violation of well-drilled procedure. If 2 had gone to inspect the damage, MacArthur should have stayed behind. But he didn't, and no one knows why. Finally, no bodies were ever recovered. In the water surrounding the Flannan Isles, the remains of shipwreck victims were often found washed ashore within days, but with Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, not one of them ever returned. And it is precisely because of these details that, although the board's conclusion may seem plausible on the surface, it still leaves behind mysteries that no one has been able to explain to this day. From the very first days after the story began to spread, the rumors started to take shape. Some believed that one of the 3 lighthouse keepers had gone mad, murdered the other 2, and then, overwhelmed by panic, thrown himself into the sea. Others thought the men had simply grown tired of their isolated life and walked away from the lighthouse together, never to return. There was no evidence for any of these claims, but such theories persisted for one simple reason: no one knew what had truly happened. In the years that followed, the theories grew even stranger. Post-war articles speculated that they might have been abducted by foreign spies. Others suggested the appearance of a sea creature or even a phantom ship that had made landfall on the very night of the disappearance. Eventually, some even claimed that the 3 men had been taken by an extraterrestrial force. Certain American magazines once wrote that when Joseph Moore entered the lighthouse, he found a half-eaten meal on the table and logbook entries that described sheer terror and chaos. But no official report ever confirmed any of these details. What remained in the log were simple notes about the weather and storm damage. Nothing about mental distress, no tears, no cries in the night. Those elements were nothing more than fiction. And still, time moved on. From 1900 to 1971, the lighthouse at Island Moor continued its operation without incident. Keepers came and went. No one else disappeared. No one ever reported anything unusual. Finally, in 1971, the light was automated, no longer requiring human hands to maintain it. Since then, Island Moor has only been visited for scheduled maintenance. But the story of the 3 vanished men remains untouched. No bodies were ever recovered. No witnesses ever emerged. No clear answer was ever found. And because of that, the mystery has never truly ended. If today's story made you reflect or reminded you of other unsolved mysteries you've heard before, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to join us on more journeys into the strange and hidden corners of history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next video.